Hello guys, and welcome back to Joe's Ventures, and today we're doing part 101 of our Planet Zoo Mod Spotlights. We take a look at some of the wonderful mods people have been making and use them to talk about some of the wonderful biodiversity that we share our world with. So, since last the part 100, I wanted to be special. I didn't have too many fish. This is kind of going to be our last big thing of fish. There's a couple fish that crash and the mods hadn't been fixed yet that I'll cover later, but this is kind of going to be our last big mod update thing for fishes. So once we get that sorted, and then 1.2 will be coming out hopefully end of this week, and it'll be quite fun because there's a lot of new mods there. So we're going to be starting off today. We've got a couple returning animals we're starting off with. We've got the Kukule killifish. Really awesome little guy here. So these guys are really cute little guys, as you see here, made by Leaf and Buffsu. Remade them all for themselves, which is really awesome. So these guys are a type of killfish or live-bearing fish in the family Notobranchidae, which includes African riverines and things like that. And their name means false gill, so that's their scientific name Notobrachius, which means false gill. These guys are a freshwater species. They're also bethnopelagic and non-migratory. So they like deep open water and tend to hang around the same habitat year-round. They don't really migrate. They live in tropical waters that range from 22 to 28 degrees Celsius. And their habitat typically includes the Kukule River and the Upper Zambezi River in Africa. And they're not a very big fish. They're probably typical in size for most fishes. They get about 6 centimeters long on average length. And in terms of their breeding, these guys are bottom spawners, so they tend to hang out near the bottom of the water, and that's where they will spawn. And they are quite difficult to maintain in aquariums because of this. They need deep areas to breed. Let's see, is there one swimming around? I think they're all moving up to get food, but let's leave it for the moment. Really cute guys. So, yeah, these guys are also considered least concern. And they do have some commercial value. People do like keeping them in aquariums, like very similar to things like betas and stuff like that, but they're a little bit harder to keep than betas. But yeah, really cool. And they also have a 5-month incubation, so that means the babies in the eggs will have to incubate for 5 months. And then they, obviously being a mouth brooder, often these guys will have the babies in their mouths, things like that. Yeah, really cool little guys here. Nice to cover these guys. Again, done by Leaf and Buffsu. Really did a wonderful job, and you can see they remade the model, and you can see how much nicer it looks how they made it. So you can see it's got like much more reddish on it, and then you can see the bluish and then the greenish on the dorsal fin back there. Looks really nice. Big fan. So next we went on to another one done by Leaf and Buffsu. We've got the Oscar fish. So another really cool fish. Another model done by Leaf and Buffsu, done them by themselves, which is really awesome. So the Oscar fish, these guys are a type of cichlid. They're also known as the tiger Oscar or the velvet Oscar. These guys come from tropical South America, and they've been introduced as a food fish, but also a popular aquarium fish in Europe and the United States as well. And they've also been introduced in areas such as India, China, Australia, and the US. So these guys are also quite a big fish. They've been reported to grow up to about 45 centimeters or about 18 inches long, and then about 1.6 kilograms to 3.5 pounds in weight. And the wild caught, they're typically darkly colored with these yellow ring spots on their dorsal fin as well, but there's lots of different variation within that as well. And they've also been subject to limited fin nipping by piranha, which seems they occur in the same habitat, which is pretty interesting. And they also can rapidly alter their colorations, which is pretty cool, which they actually use it for territorial combat and other types of behavior between conspecifics or other Oscar cichlids. So typically they'll change their colors to kind of display that, which is really cool. And juveniles typically have a different coloration from the adults, and striped in orange and one over wavy bands that have spotted heads. As you can kind of see here, looks really interesting. Really cool fish. So in terms of distribution, these guys are native to Brazil. They can be found in Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Guyana, French Guiana, Suriname, Peru, and Venezuela. And they occur typically in the Amazon River Basin as well, but they occur in a few other river basins. And their natural habitat, they tend to like living in slow-moving whitewater habitats, but have seen sheltering under submerged branches and things like that. And feral populations occur in northern Australia, China, and the Florida, USA, because of the large amount of the trade for these guys, since a lot of these guys are quite common kept in aquariums. All considered an ornamental fish. They typically are limited in distribution because they don't really like cold water, and their lower lethal limit is about 12 degrees. So anything cooler than that, then for prolonged periods, they could potentially die just because they couldn't handle it, which is kind of sad, but good for invasive because they won't become invasive in areas where it's too cold, which is good. In terms of reproduction, these guys are sexually monomorphic, and they are suggested to grow quickly. Males are suggested to grow more quickly in some naturally occurring strains, and the males are noted for having dark blotches on the base of their fins as well. And these species will reach sexual maturity about a year of age, and they commonly will continue to reproduce for about 9 to 10 years. And the frequency of the spawning depends on the occurrence of rain, and these guys are also biparental substrate spawners, though we don't really know how that is in the wild. But in captivity, they're known to select and clean a gently flattened horizon where they lay their eggs. Smaller females will lay about 300 to 500 eggs, while larger females can lay up to 2,500 to 3,000 eggs. And like most cichlids, these guys will practice brood care, and during the duration of brood care in the wild is unknown, but they will take care of their brood, so they're quite okay parents, which is really cool. And these guys are also very popular in the aquarium hobby. They're often commonly kept for food as well, because they're omnivores, and most fish that eat these guys as well will be like catfish and things like that. In the wild, they'll consume shrimp, insect larvae, snails, and fruits and nuts on a seasonal basis. And they also are an absolute requirement for vitamin C, so they can develop health problems if they don't get enough vitamin C. And then in the wild, that's what they eat. But in captivity, obviously, you feed them things like crayfish, worms, insects like flies, crickets, and grasshoppers. That's good food for them in captivity, and kind of reflects what they eat in the wild. They're also quite territorial. They will, in an aquarium or in the wild, they will pretty much mark the area and be very aggressive towards other fish, encroaching on their established territory. And the size varies on the aggressiveness and the size of the fish itself and the surroundings. And once an Oscar establishes its own territory, it will fiercely defend it. And in terms of the aquarium trade, there's lots of different types of varieties that you can get. You can also get things like leucistic, albino, and xanthic forms. So albino pretty much means pure white. Leucistic means pretty much yellowish, and xanthic can mean a lot of the greys, much more grey. They also have like long fin varieties as well that have been developed, and lots of people breeding for different colours and things, which is pretty cool, and these are just pretty cool fish. So yeah, really, really awesome. Again, that was done by Leaf and Buffsoo. So our next guy is the Hubhead Whitefish. That's come from Leaf, Buffsoo, and Fishing Planet. This is another port we've got going on here. So really, really cool guy here. So this is the Hubhead Whitefish. These guys are a type of salmon. The genus name is Kangurus, which means of the eye angle, which is pretty interesting. These are also marine fish in freshwater, brackish, so they typically can move around all these areas, so they're like that. And they're also anadromous, so they can swim up and down rivers and live in both fresh and saltwater environments. And they're actually a polar species. They tend to live in much cooler waters. They typically live in the Arctic Ocean basin, so they can be found in Finland, eastern Siberia, Alaska, and Canada, eastward to the Mackenzie Drainage, and they're typically protected there as well. They're also quite a decently sized fish. These guys can get to about 50 centimeters long. Though a more common length is about a foot long, about 32 centimeters, and they have a maximum age of about 14 years they can live up to. And in terms of their biology and their stuff like that, they typically inhabit coastal waters near the shore, and they get their name the Humphead Whitefish because they got this large hump kind of there where they kind of get their name. And adults typically will be there, and adipose fin well developed, so these guys will have a well developed one, especially in males as well. And typically they got this dark midnight color around them, things like that, which is really, really interesting. And they get this whitest color where they get the Humphead Whitefish, which is where they get their name. They typically like lower reaches of rivers with slow currents, large lakes and tributaries. Also can be found in floodplain lakes, deltas and estuaries, brackish waters as well. And they migrate up to 1,200 kilometers inland just to spawn. And they overwinter near river mouths. But there are also non-migratory freshwater populations. So some will basically just go up to spawn. Some populations will stay in the freshwater year-round, but most of the times some populations will go out in the ocean. Very similar to other types of salmon, things like that, so it's very interesting. And they are not, as I mentioned here, and the adults would typically feed on mollusks, crustaceans, and priminoid larvae, so pretty generalist in that regard. In terms of their lifestyle and breeding or life cycle, upward spawning migrations may be extensive, but some populations do seldom venture far upstream, and others may even go out of the sea at all. Go to sea at all, so it just depends. Sometimes they'll spend all their lives in the rivers, just depends on the population, things like that. Mature adults migrate upstream as early as like June, and they spawn in October. And it is assumed that the young hatch in late winter to spring, subsequently moving downwards to return as mature adults about 4 to 6 years later. So they spawn, then they go out to sea, they grow up out in sea or in the river mouths or upriver or downriver technically. And then it's when they go up 4 to 6 years later, when they're big enough, they start to spawn again, which is pretty cool. They're also a species of least concern, which is pretty good, and they're considered a commercial fish for fisheries and aquaculture since people eat them, and they are pretty cool fish. I do like these humpheads. Um, Whitefish, these humphead whitefish are very, very nice. They look very pretty. So really awesome mod that we get to have. So next we're moving on to, we've already done the black crappie, so we've got the white crappie done by Leaf and Buffsu. They're all coming back from a feed. So luckily the white crappie is a cool one, Proximus annulirus. So these guys are a type of sunfish. These guys are a freshwater fish as well. They like temperate waters up to about 31 degrees Celsius, so they don't like it too warm. And these guys will live in North America, typically found in the Great Lakes, Hudson Bay, and Mississippi rivers. And they can be found from New York, USA, to Ontario, Canada. So that's where they can be found. Minnesota, South Dakota, and then down to the Gulf of Mexico in the USA. And Gulf ranges from Mobile Bay in Georgia and Alabama. They can also be found in Texas as well. So typically around the eastern side of the US is where they can be found, which is pretty cool. And in terms of their size and maturity, they typically reach as maximum about 53 centimeters long, but a common length is about 25 centimeters. So a particularly big individual can get up to about 50 centimeters. And they have a maximum published weight of about 2.4 kilograms and a maximum reported age of about 10 years, which is pretty interesting. So in terms of biology, these guys will typically occur in sand-bottomed or mud-bottomed lakes or brackish waters or black waters of creeks, to small and lake rivers as well, and lakes and ponds, things like that. And they often can be found in turbid water as well, so they like that turbid water. Adults will typically forage on fish, so as adults they're piscivores, similar to the black crappie. They will feed on shads and other small fish, but as youngsters, they'll typically consume small invertebrates, which includes micro crustaceans and small insects. But again, like the black crappie, these guys will often just eat what's available. There's been some study in looking into what different populations eat different times. Some will eat more insects, but typically adults will have a more fish-based diet, and youngsters will eat more like crustaceans and larvae and things like that, and small insects. Yeah, really cool. And in terms of the behavior, these guys will deposit their eggs on a variety of aquatic plants, or on a variety of aquatic plants. So typically they've got a viscous kind of glue to them that will stick to these plants and be able to hide them, which is pretty interesting and also pretty cool. And they're also another species considered least concern, also considered harmless, and they're also considered a game fish. So they're not something that's really hunted commercially, not too much, but people who want to go catch a nice fish will obviously try and catch crappie if you live in that part of the US where they live. Yeah, really, really awesome fish, and one made by Just Leaf and Buffsu. I think it came out rather nice. Cool to see some custom fishing made instead of just sports, but personally, I just like both. I like seeing more animals that I get to talk about on here. So next up, another one done by Leaf and Buffsu, Dream Team, it seems. That was a rhyme. We've got the clown knifefish, also known as the clown featherback. So these guys are a really cool type of fish. These guys are a bony tongue, and they kind of live in their own family Operidae, which means featherback or knifefish. And these guys are also freshwater pelagic fish, and they live in tropical waters from about 24 to 28 degrees Celsius. And these guys are native to Asia. They can be found in the Mekong basins of Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. They can also be found in the Chao Phraya and Mekong basins, which is pretty cool. So these guys are also quite a long fish. They get about a meter long, or about 100 centimeters, and they have a maximum published weight about 5 kilograms, so quite a bit bigger. And guys are quite differentiated from other members of this genus and species, and other genus and family, as these guys have these large spots going down there. They're quite silvery body. They've got these large spots, and then they have this large fin here that goes around like that, and quite silvery in that regard. So really, really cool. Really, I do like these fish. I love clown knifefish. They're very awesome. And in terms of their biology, they typically inhabit flowing waters from large to medium-sized rivers, and within the Mekong mainstream, they will occur in pools and things like that. They also can be found basin-wide mainstream of the lower Mekong. They're typically a surface predator, so they feed on surface-feeding fish, crustaceans, and insects. So they're kind of a mid-level predator in that regard. That's what's swimming down there. Really, really cool guy here. So they're also quite crepuscular or nocturnal. So typically they come out either at dusk or dawn or at night. And yeah, that's when they kind of do their hunting and things like that. They typically move into inundated forests during high water periods, so times where there's flooding. So typically from June to October. And individuals from the Great Lake regions have also been shipped to the markets in Thailand, since they're also a commercial fish. People do like eating them. And males will typically guard the eggs until they hatch, which is another really interesting fact about them. And yeah, they're also considered least concerns, so they're doing quite well. And they're also quite common in aquariums, especially larger aquariums. They're quite a common fish to see, just because they look so cool. And they're also quite a commercial fish, since people eat them, especially in Asia. So really, really cool species. So yeah, another cool guy here. So next, moving on, we've got by Leaf Buff Zoo and Fishing Planet, we've got the northern snakehead. Another cool fish. How can you not love these guys? So these guys are type of, they're kind of related to gouramis and snakeheads. So they're the group the snakeheads, or Chinanidae. So really cool guys. These guys are deep open water fish, or bethnopelagic. They typically live in fresh water as well, and they're like subtropical waters from about 4 to 22 degrees. And these guys are typically found in Asia. So the Amur, that's where they're typically found. They sound southwest of Zhejiang and Henan Island, China, but they've also been introduced elsewhere, such as Japan and the USA. They've also been found in. And due to them being large predators, they compete with other fish, and this causes them to cause adverse effects on the environment that they've been introduced into, with obviously, since there's no natural predators and all that. So these guys are also another quite large fish. They can get to about 100 centimeters long, or about typically a foot, 3 feet long, or about a meter long, 100 centimeters. About a maturity, they typically get about 30 centimeters, so they're mature at about 30, and then they can grow up to 100. And in terms of their maximum published weight, they can weigh about 8 kilograms, so quite a big guy there. And they can actually stay out of water for quite a long time, for about 3 or 4 days, at temperatures ranging from 10 to 15 degrees. So they're able to pretty much hang out on land for a few days as well, which is pretty interesting. And they're a typical ambush predator. They tend to lie and wait for predators. They typically wait for prey. They're very ambush predator, as you can see by their large teeth. You can see they also get the name the snakehead, because they've got a very snake-like head. And they've also got this like a reticulated pattern that almost reminds me of like a python, which is really, really awesome. Got these large teeth as well, which is good because they are a predator. They've got this long body as well. Really, really interesting. In terms of hunting, these guys will mainly hunt in the morning or in the evenings. So that makes them crepuscular. And they feed primarily on other fish, as you can see by their large teeth. So they go after slightly bigger prey. They reach maturity at about 2 years of age and at about 30 centimeters long. And typically they will spawn from June and July, so about that time. And the eggs are pelagic, so the eggs can be found in open water. And they are utilized for human consumption. People do like eating them, and especially where they've been introduced as well. And as I mentioned, they've kind of found in the Amur River, but they're not really been evaluated, so they're data deficient. They're also mentioned a potential pest, because they've been introduced in places where they are doing damage, such as the lakes, and I believe also in Florida. They're also a commercial species. People do like fishing for them, for aquaculture as well. People do like eating them. People do like hunting them as well, or fishing for them, so they're considered a game fish. And they're also kept in public aquariums, because they're such a big and interesting looking fish. People do like to come and look at these wonderful guys, and how can you blame them? I think these guys are really, truly interesting fish. I do love them a lot. So that's our kind of freshwater fish done mostly. So that one was done by Leaf Buff Zoo and Fishing Planet. We've got next one. Hopefully, you guys don't giggle too much at this one. We've got the slippery dick. So, a really cool little fish here. The slippery dick. So, these guys are a type of wrasse. These guys are marine fish. They're typically associated with reefs and things like that. And they live in depths between 10 to 15 meters and typically living in tropical water. These guys, in terms of their habitats, they can be found in the Western Atlantic. So, they can be found from North Carolina down into Bermuda and into Brazil, so quite a wide range, pretty much most of the reef areas of the Gulf of Mexico. And they're also quite small, so very small compared to a lot of the fish we've been talking about. These guys only get 35 centimeters long, so not the biggest fish, not as small as like a killfish, but kind of about a foot long. It's kind of smallish for some of these fishes. That's a maximum length as well, though, so typically they probably get about 15 centimeters. So wrasse are typically not that big fish, unless you include like humphead wrasse that can get quite large, but these guys are definitely on the smaller side. And their also published weight is about 146 grams, so as like you said, not the biggest fish, but most fish are pretty small anyway, so it doesn't really bother me too much. Still a really cool animal. And you can see they've got these little markings on them. They're typically like bluish silver, but they've also got these two dark stripes running from the eye and down to the caudal fin. And you can see it also gets splotchy as well. And large adult males will have green to black shading as well, and things like that, and these irregular light bands as well on these kind of silvery bluish bodies, so very interesting. And in terms of the habitat, these guys are typically found in rocky and reef areas in shallow waters, but they are also less commonly found in seagrass beds. And they typically feed on other fishes and gastropods. So that includes like marine snails and things like that, marine slugs. And they actually also form leks during breeding season, so that's when a bunch of males, oh, he's kind of floating, a bunch of animals will kind of hang around and then they'll display, and the females get to pick the male with the best display. They're also a progynous to hermaphrodite, so they basically will start their life as a female, and as they get bigger, they will turn into a male, which is pretty interesting. And in terms of their lifestyle, these guys are a pelagic spawner, so they tend to spawn in open water. And sex reversal is actually completed in more than 3 or 4 weeks, so about a month they can move from male to female, or female to male, typically. It's typically female to male. And the length of the sex change is about 30 centimeters long, which is pretty interesting. So once they reach that side, the biggest ones are kind of the males, so they can compete. The reason this works is so basically any young ones can be breeding as females and laying eggs, and then once they get big enough to be able to compete with other males, they turn into a male and then kind of compete for females that way. So that's very interesting that a lot of fish do that. And they're also considered least concern, which is pretty cool. And they're considered harmless, and they're also considered quite a common commercial aquarium fish, since they're quite a common reef fish. And pretty cool. I do like these guys, and don't get fooled by their name, they're still really cool. This because they're called slippery dicks. Their scientific name is Halicheris bivaticus, which I believe means salt pig. And the genus name is Halicheris, which means salt pig, which is very, very interesting, and I think they're quite cool. So another cool fish there. Here we've got our last fish for the day. We have got the Face Rabbitfish, which is another cool little fish. Let's have a look at these guys. Love these guys. So these guys are a type of rabbitfish, which are also in turn is a type of sturgeonfish. So their scientific name means Sigurus, which means a fish or rabbitfish, by the similarity of its nose. So it kind of looks like a rabbit in that regard, where they get their name rabbitfish. And these guys are marine reef-associated fish, and they can live in depths between 1 to 30 meters, usually between 1 to 30. And they're tropical fish, so they tend to live in warm water. And they don't really live where the slippery dick lives, in the Western Atlantic. These guys live in the Western Pacific, so they can be found in the Philippines, Indonesia, New Guinea, Great Barrier Reef. They've been seen in Vanuatu, also New Caledonia, the Caroline Islands, the Marshall Islands, and there have been some sightings in other islands like Tonga as well. So that's pretty interesting. Likes a tropical climate, these guys. And these guys are a decent sized fish. They get about 25 centimeters long, maximum. But their common length is about 20 centimeters. And these guys, as you can see, they're quite brightly colored. You can see they're pretty much yellow across them. But they've got a white face and a couple of black bands across their face there. They've also got this darkening at the edges of their fins. You can see the anal, dorsal, and caudal fins as well. So the front part of their face is kind of white with these two dark bands as well, which is really, really cool and gives us that distinct look. In terms of their habitat, they're also considered territorial, and they typically occur in coral-rich lagoons and seaweed reefs. They're often also found among staghorn corals, and they usually occur either singly or in pairs, but juveniles and subadults occasionally occur in these large schools, where they feed on algae, which grows from the dead bases of coral branches. And they're also known, they are venomous, so they're known for actually inflicting quite painful stings, and you got to be careful from that. But still, people do keep them in captivity, so they're relatively safe to handle as long as you know. And they're considered least concern, and they could probably be potentially like increasing a little bit because of a lot of corals dying because of coral bleaching and things like that. And they're minor commercial value in terms of fisheries. People don't really eat them, but they are quite a common fish for aquariums. So yeah, really, really cool. And a lot of these species, as I mentioned, they get affected by like pollution. Climate change is causing bleaching of corals. So while they're considered least concern, that doesn't mean they're not at risk of declines because of a lot of human-made factors, including pollution, coral bleaching, overhunting, lots of different things. So even though they're considered least concern, they're not necessarily safe. And last but most certainly not least, oh wait, I've got to cover this. The slippery dick was done by Leaf and Buffsu, and the fox face rabbitfish was done by Leaf and Buffsu, along with 1, 2, 3 3D models. So that's done. And last but not least, we have got here, we've got ourselves a nice mammal. We've got the Arabian Orcs. So this has been ported from a new species into a new species from like, I covered this guy back way in the beginning, but I thought it'd be worthwhile covering it again since we've got it as a new species, which is really, really cool. This is the Arabian Orcs, also known as the White Orcs. So these guys are quite a big animal. They get about a meter tall at the shoulder and weigh about 70 kilograms or about 150 pounds. And you can see their coat is pretty much almost uniformly white, except for these kind of dark socks, as you can see here, missing these white bands also on their tail there, and their face is kind of blackish. And they also have these kind of long, straight, or slightly ring horns. And in males, they get quite a bigger. They can get about 75 centimeters in males, and females are typically a bit smaller. So, though it's typically unisex, so both of them can have these quite large horns. And they typically rest in the heat of the day, and they can detect rainfall and move for it because they have home ranges, with herds having like ranges of 3,000 square kilometers. And herds are also typically mixed-sex and usually contain between 2 and 15 animals, though herds of 100 have been reported, though they're generally not aggressive towards each other. And then they can live a peaceful sometimes, which is herds can hang around for sometimes as well, so that's really cool. In terms of other than humans, their only big predator is wolves, and in captivity they can have a lifespan of up to 20 years. And in periods of drought, though, they may actually succumb to malnutrition and dehydration, though other causes of death can be snake bites, fighting between males, disease, and drowning during flash floods and things like that. So this is a species that has been greatly impacted by human hunting. Historically, they used to live throughout most of the Middle East, and the early 1800s they could still be found in Palestine, much of Iraq, and most of the Arabian Peninsula. But during hunting of the early 19th and the early 20th century, a lot of their range has really been pushed back towards Saudi Arabia. And now, basically, they can be found in Jordan until around, I believe, the 1930s. They were basically considered extinct in the wild until there had been reintroductions, as we'll get into. And in terms of their ecology, these guys typically feed on grasses. They feed on a wide variety of herbs and tubers and things like that, which is pretty interesting. So you can find the male. There's the male. He's the male. Really beautiful guy. So these guys will follow these infrequent range and then find the new plants to grow after, and they can actually go several weeks without water, which is very interesting. And in terms of their behavior, these guys are not wandering, and things like that when they're not doing that. They'll often dig like shallow depressions in soft ground under shrubs and trees for resting, and they're able to detect rainfall from a distance and follow the new plant growth. As I mentioned, these herds can grow a lot in size and things like that. Bachelor herds do not occur, and single territorial males are actually rare, and they typically have this straightforward hierarchy that involves all females and males above the age of 7 months. So Arabian Orcs actually will maintain visual contact with other herd members as well, with subordinate males taking positions behind the main herd and the outlying females. And then separate, the males will search areas where the herd last visited, settling into a solitary existence upon the herd's return. And when water and grazing conditions permit, the males will establish territories, and when bachelor males are solitary as well. And a dominance hierarchy is typically created with posturing displays, which sometimes can get into fights, which can cause injury. But they try and avoid that as much as possible. And they often will use the horns to. Females will use them as well to defend their territories and stuff, and their resources from interlopers and things like that. Another really cool thing about these guys is that these guys have lots of changes in the physiology at different times of year to help them survive. So in the Arabian Orcs will actually drastically reduce its minimal fasting metabolic rate to be basically lie completely inactive between these shade streams during the day. So basically helps them save energy. And they basically let their body temperatures rise during the heat of the day and use less evaporating cooling and retain more of their body heat. So basically that's a way to basically save water. And they also have arteries that allow for heat exchange between warm and cooler blood, especially in their nose as well. So they have a lot of really interesting adaptations to help them survive in the desert, which is really interesting. In terms of, they've also been quite important humans as well, especially. They're considered the national animal Jordan, and they've actually been quite a important role in their kind of the myth of the unicorns, because if you look at them from the side, they basically look like they only have one horn, which is pretty interesting. So typically in that area, that's where they get the myth of the unicorn. And sadly, as I mentioned, the conservation, these guys are common, as I mentioned, around Jordan and most parts of the Middle East and things like that. And they were hunted to extinction in the wild in about 1972. But by 1980, a bunch of them had been in captivity because people were breeding them, like people in Texas and people in their private collections, things like that. They had been breeding them. So luckily, there had been efforts to reintroduce them into the wild. There were efforts from particularly places like the South San Diego Wild Animal Park, where they introduced wild populations as well. One of the large populations now lives in a large fence reserved in Saudi Arabia, which is quite huge. And as of June 2011, is believed to be went from basically extinct in the wild, and now they're considered vulnerable. There's an estimate that typically there's about 1,200 Arabian Orcs in the wild as of 4th of December 2020. And there's about 6 to 7,000 held in captivity worldwide in both zoos, preserves, and private collections. Some of these are in free roaming, like large fence enclosures. Some of them are in zoos. And this is actually the first time a species has gone from being basically extinct in the wild to vulnerable, and which is why they're considered so important. So there's sanctuary stuff popping up for these guys. People are trying to help populations. The captive populations obviously supplying like reserves and things like that. So people are really trying to help with the conservation of that, and that's why they're considered vulnerable, because there's quite a sound captive population that could be used to help the wild ones. So that's considered vulnerable. They've got lots of protections and stuff like that. So basically, they just need help. There's not too much impacting them now, other than like poaching and potentially habitat degradation, and they just need more to breed more, and then they'll be fine, which is pretty cool. And there's also been some sanctuaries and stuff like that. Pretty much was actually the first ever site. The Oman's Arabian Orc Sanctuary was actually removed from a UNESCO World Heritage site because they wanted to open up for oil prospecting, and sadly, the site has actually been reduced. They used to have 450 oryxes living on the site until about 65 in 2007. But now there's less than 4 breeding pairs left as it opened up to drilling. But luckily, there are quite a common species. There's about, as I mentioned, about 8,000 in the world, with about a little over 1,000 living in the wild in a variety of different areas. So really, they are doing okay in that regard, and we just want to see more of them in the wild because they're just such cool animals. But yeah, I think this would be a great place to end the video. This mod was done by Leaf and J2Bex, I believe you say that, J2Bex, which is a very old modder from like the beginning, like about a year ago or so. It's nice to see their mod come into a nice new species, things like that. Really like seeing it again. So yeah, I think this would be a very great place to end the video. So I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you guys like and subscribe. Always remember to hit the little bell icon to get notified about anything. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you guys like and subscribe. And bye-bye.